So, when I first heard about the task, my assignment to give you a flavor of China in 10 minutes, I thought that this is quite a challenge of its own. But so this is going to be a very personal kind of a perspective. I'm going to offer you some themes, some ideas of how I have been observing China. So I am Chinese, but I was actually born in Hong Kong, raised in Canada, and then the United States. And I've actually been a venture capitalist and an entrepreneur for the last couple of decades, mostly in Silicon Valley, but also managing investments in Asia. So I come more as an observer, and really not so much as an academic, as someone I would like to think of as a first, very much sort of an Argonaut, more of a bridge kind of a person, sharing my experience and insights to different cultures, because I find that particularly fascinating. And one of the ways I look at things is in terms of paradoxes, because I think that's very key to understanding China. It is so vast, it's so huge, that scale is the biggest challenge, really, and especially, for Americans even, we come from a country of 300 million people. To conceive of the challenges and problems, not only of the poor, but of an entire country of 1.3 billion plus people is just literally inconceivable. And scale, the idea of scale, absolute and relative scale, drives so many of the issues that you're hearing about in other countries, really everywhere. So scale is the number one thing to think about, and understand that probably the way any of you think about scale, perhaps with the exception of my colleague from India, you have no concept of what it really means to think about scale. And the second thing that happens is because of scale, there's an accelerating rate of change. Okay, this is a physical principle. It's a momentum inertia problem. You have a large mass, it's moving quickly, it tends to cause an accelerating rate of change. Just think about, Nokia was mentioned as one of the star companies in Finland, and of course it has been. But where do they sell most of their handsets? Well, easily a couple 100 million in China alone. Right? Today, this past year, something like 600 million mobile phone handsets in China. Staggering number, and the growth has been accelerating over the last decade. Everyone knows that China does have an authoritarian government and a proactive government, and they play an extremely important role. More important from a capitalist point of view or an investor point of view is, of course, the growing middle class, because that really carries the bulk of how an economy grows. Not so much just from consumerism, but every aspect of that, whether it's municipal services, government services, transportation, et cetera, education, as well as, of course, the industrial sector. And the numbers in China are always deceptive and unclear, but the numbers are anywhere from 200 to 400 million people. And largely these are becoming urban, right? The government has made a very clear statement of moving some 500 million people into the large urban centers on the East Coast. So ranging from Beijing in the north, Shanghai sort of in the middle, down to Guangzhou, Hong Kong in the south. This is a tremendous driver of change and of course of opportunity. And technology is extremely important to China, not so much in terms of just the most advanced technologies, but technology in general, because technology is what really can drive scale. So this is how I look at, these are the themes that I think are really important to understanding and thinking about China. I'm going to show you some images that I think are sort of paradoxical. So on the left is a picture of the bird's nest, which is an iconic piece of architecture in Beijing. Of course, this was during the Beijing Olympics in 2008. It was packed. I forget what the numbers are, but literally, hundreds of millions of people came to the Olympics. Less than 2 years later, that same structure is mostly deserted. And the government is struggling to figure out how can we use this in a productive capacity? How can we even maintain it? Because it turns out that the construction principles are extremely elegant and a very exciting design architecture and materials and so on. It turns out to be a nightmare in terms of maintenance. But what will they do? Okay. Here's an example from the private sector. Of course, real estate is booming in China, has been. People talk about a bubble in China. And there's a quote here from a major real estate firm that occupancy is about 38% vacancy, right? So this is much higher than what we would expect in America to be considered a very serious bubble condition. And yet this kind of construction continues, and it's tremendous. Now, this is where the comment about the middle class comes in. You know, there is a question of, you know, if they can build it, if the real estate builders build these things, this is, of course, not for the poor, but if they build it, will there eventually be enough people? Will some of those 200, 300, 400 million people migrate into the cities and live in high-rise structures like this? Questions, right? Now, here are some of the, again, themes that I think are relevant to this group. We're talking about what I call intellectual capital formation, and by that I mean people and intellectual property, ideas. Not necessarily purely high-tech in the Silicon Valley sense, but really innovative ideas, entrepreneurial ideas, but with the people component. The people aspect, I think, is extremely important, whether it is a large country like China or small countries like Singapore and Israel. The social context, the interaction, the trust, all of these terms have been mentioned, extraordinarily important. But these are some of the themes, again, that are being emphasized in China, not only by the government, but by investors and the private sector, industry, and so on. So, of course, tremendous investment in education, training, and R&D. Government has also created a large number of new universities. It has had a unfortunate side effect that has actually lowered the quality of some of the academic output. And there's also a tremendous need for, I would call, a fundamental rethinking of the type of education. You know, traditional Chinese education has emphasized rote learning. Many Chinese students not only have normal class hours, but then they have class hours after in the evenings, and young children are put under tremendous pressure from grade school, from elementary school through high school and through college to excel. And to excel means to literally memorize volumes of material and whatever the teachers teach you in an effort to regurgitate that back on examinations. And your whole life seems to be set on this course of being able to achieve high scores on your tests. Now, for me, one of the observations that creates a problem for is that while that is a good way to emphasize the training of fundamental knowledge, fundamental science, and fundamentals of history and so on, it starts off with a presumption. It inculcates in the student a presumption that whatever problems they're going to meet in life, there is a solution that someone has found before. And this is a serious problem, because how can you innovate? How can you allow yourself to explore, to try new things, to accept the fact that if you don't fail, you have never exceeded the limits of your ignorance, right? The problem of creativity and innovation, one, of course, we're defining this as creative and not in the artistic sense, not purely in the artistic sense, but in a problem-solving sense. If you want to solve a problem that someone else presumably has not solved, because otherwise it wouldn't be a problem anymore, then how can you expect to find that answer in someone else's history? Okay, so intellectual property is, of course, very important. One of the major companies in China, Huawei, which is a telecom network equipment provider, very interesting history, but 2 years ago became the company in the world, the company that had the largest number of international patents in the world. And this was, of course, unheard of. It had been traditionally the purview of Japanese companies and Philips. So they had filed something like 1,700 some patents. This is on a world scale. Of course, in terms of U.S. patents, IBM still has something like 5,000 per year. But and my Chinese friends tell me that A lot of these patents may not be actually that solid or worthwhile, but the point is that people are beginning to understand that intellectual property has value, and this is important. The government has improved the judicial system to also support protection of that, although at the moment it is still somewhat sketchy. The domestic capital markets, from private investment through public investment, is a huge story. Of course, economic growth through domestic mergers and acquisition as well as international acquisitions. And it's very important, just over the last 5 years, I think, both the aggressiveness and the thoughtfulness with which China, the government, as well as companies, have been pursuing a global perspective, I think is a very important theme as well. So what I want to leave you with is a concept that I call chaotic pragmatism. Right? Because Chinese traditionally, historically, have always been a pragmatic people. We're practical, we want to solve problems. We tend not to look for problems outside. There are more than enough problems at home. And despite the fact that there is such a strong government influence, and despite the fact that as companies grow larger, they inevitably somehow integrate with the government in some capacity. And the government is very directive and has all kinds of policies, all kinds of regulations. Really the prevailing attitude, if you are to visit China and you talk to a number of people, a diversity of people, you get the feeling that things are really very chaotic, and yet the government does maintain a certain sense of direction. And I think that what we see is a tremendous diversity, a scope of experiments and explorations in China that the government, we call it, there's one eye open, one eye closed. They allow a number of things that are sort of borderline policy or borderline whatever, and they'll let them try it to see. If they can succeed, then those can become models that can be learned from and applied elsewhere. And if they don't, they get buried and get forgotten, and people just move on. So it's really, I think at the end of the day, innovation is about two things. One is it's about problem solving. It's about actually finding solutions to problems, whether it's for the poor or for high technology. And the other is it's really about people. It's about how people interact, how people function, how people need to be motivated and encouraged. And that's part of what my personal mission in China is to do, is to help them understand that there are broader ways to be as a person. So when I taught my class on innovation and entrepreneurship in Beijing, the first thing I told my students is that innovation is a matter of personal character development. It's not about technology. It's not about the money, venture capital and all that. It's not about the government. It's about how you show up as a person. Thank you very much.